They said he was just the bride's dad. Not a hero, not a name. Just a shadow in old boots who walked too slow for the tempo of the day. That's what the bartender joked as he polished glasses, watching Master Sergeant Glenn Parker adjust his collar in the mirror by the side door. The young ones didn't know what they were seeing. Just a man in a dated military uniform with a silver stripe down one leg, medals across his chest like forgotten constellations, his back straight from decades of discipline, not pride, and eyes that had seen wars even history books skipped. But to them, he was just the quiet old guy in formal blues holding his daughter's arm with trembling fingers. And if you've ever believed that no man who served should be laughed at, not at his daughter's wedding, not ever, then like and subscribe, because what happened at this wedding will make you believe in silence, respect, and legacy again. It was a perfect fall day when Lily Parker married Aaron Vance in a renovated barn that smelled faintly of pine and warmth. String lights draped over exposed beams like constellations caught in amber, the kind of wedding that looked like a Pinterest board but felt more like home. And as guests gathered in polished shoes and pastel dresses, Glenn stood behind the barn quietly, his hands slightly shaking as he pinned a faded insignia in a place on his chest. Not because he was nervous, but because this was the only suit he'd ever owned that mattered. Lily came to him just before the ceremony, radiant, gentle, folding her arms around his in a way that only daughters do when they still remember who steadied their bike or brushed gravel out of their knees. And she whispered, "Let's show them what real tradition looks like." Before the music even began, the doors swung open and the two walked in together, him in full dress blues, slow and steady, her in white silk with sun glancing off her veil. And that's when the first whisper slid through the crowd like a crack in stained glass. "Oh God, is he wearing a costume?" One of the groomsmen's friends snorted under his breath, drink already in hand, sunglasses still on indoors. His name was Bryce, no rank, no respect, just loud opinions and cheap shoes. And within seconds, his comments snowballed. "Hope he salutes the buffet. Maybe he got lost on the way to a parade. Some people need to let the past go." But Glenn heard it. He always heard it. Even through decades of learning to listen past explosions in silence, he heard it. And he didn't blink, didn't speak, just walked Lily down the aisle, as steady as any man could be who had survived more in 1 year than most people dared in a lifetime. During dinner, he sat off to the side of the head table, not from shame, but from instinct, observing more than inserting, like he always had. Lily tried to pull him in for the toasts and games, but he waved her off with a gentle smile. "I'm just here to watch you be happy," he said, sipping his water like it was whiskey, back straight, metals gleaming quietly under the overhead lights. But then Bryce got up to speak. He wasn't on the toast schedule. He wasn't even invited to talk. But a little liquid courage and a lot of ego made him tap the glass anyway. "To Lily and Aaron," he started, slurring slightly, "and to her dad, who I guess thought this was a military ball instead of a wedding." And that one line made the room tighten. Some laughed, unsure. Others froze. Lily went pale. Glenn said nothing. "Seriously, though," Bryce continued. "Props to the guy. Bet he still uses Morse code to order pizza." And a few chuckles tried to surface until Lily stood. Just stood. Bryce kept talking, but nobody was listening anymore. Lily's voice cut through like steel wrapped in velvet. "You don't know who you're mocking." And the room shifted. "That man," she said, "never missed a single letter I sent during his last deployment. He watched my recitals from halfway across the world. He held 3 of his men in his arms as they bled out on a mountainside, and he still made it home to teach me how to drive." The mic was no longer a prop. It was a weapon of truth. "So if my father showing up in the uniform he earned makes you uncomfortable, I suggest you step outside. Or better yet, don't come back in." There was silence, the kind that drowns sound. And then the unthinkable happened. Her cousin stood and left. Then an aunt. Then a groomsman. And within minutes, the entire side of the bride's family began standing, filing out past Bryce like a moral tide, leaving him alone near the open bar with nothing but his melting drink and a room that no longer respected the sound of his voice. Outside, Glenn sat quietly near the fire pit, the kindling still unlit, staring into dusk like he could still read the wind. Lily sat beside him, lifted his hand, and said, "They know now, Dad. They finally know." He didn't nod, didn't cry, just smiled in that barely their way the strongest men do. Men who don't need spotlights, only stillness. And inside the reception hall, for the first time since dinner began, the music stopped, not because of a technical issue, but because the DJ, too, had stepped outside to shake Glenn's hand. The wind had softened by the time Glenn Parker stood up from the bench outside the venue, brushing the light ash from his slacks where someone had just relit the fire pit nearby. The smoke curling gently in the blue of twilight as if the air itself had started listening. Inside, the wedding hall still held warmth and string lights and the faded sound of uncertain music, but the spirit had changed. Something invisible and deep now threading through every guest still seated, most of whom had just returned after standing with Glenn outside, having silently walked out during Bryce's impromptu insult parade like a quiet rebellion. Bryce, red-cheeked and flustered, now sat with a drink in each hand, unsure which one would fix what he'd broken. The groom, Aaron, hadn't said much when it happened, just stood beside Lily and watched her take the moment in her own hands like a weapon carved from truth. And now, as the cake was cut and awkward jokes tried to paper over the rip, Lily took her father's hand and gently pulled him toward the mic. "Can I ask something?" she said, her voice calmer than anyone expected. "Can my dad give the next toast?" A few murmurs flickered in the air like kindling meeting a spark. Bryce leaned back, muttering something under his breath, but no one heard him, and more importantly, no one cared. Glenn didn't hesitate. He walked to the front, slow and measured, adjusting his cuffs once like it mattered, then took the microphone with a hand that had once held fractured bones, field radios, and the lifeless fingers of men who didn't get to return. "You don't need to clap," he began, his voice soft but unmistakably firm, "and you don't need to thank me either. I'm not here to impress you. I'm here because my daughter asked me to be." The crowd fell into the kind of silence that comes not from tension but from gravity, like everyone suddenly realized they'd been floating until his voice called them back to earth. "You see this uniform?" Glenn continued, glancing down. "To some, it's a costume. To others, a symbol. But to me, it's simply the last thing a lot of good men ever wore. So I wear it not to be noticed, but to remember." And just like that, the room was no longer a wedding hall, it was a cathedral of memory. I've missed birthdays, first steps, and quiet nights with my wife so this country could go to bed safe. But what I didn't miss was raising this woman. He nodded toward Lily. "And if that earns me a chair in the corner instead of a seat at the bar, I'll take it. Happily. Because no table could ever mean more than walking her down that aisle." Across the room, people stared at their glasses like they didn't deserve the toast anymore. Some wiped eyes. Others couldn't even look up. But Glenn wasn't done. "Now, I heard someone here had a laugh at my expense earlier," he added, not naming names, but letting the words settle exactly where they were meant to land. "And that's okay. You're young. You haven't lived enough to understand what dignity looks like when it doesn't shout. You'll learn. Or you won't. Either way, that's not my burden." Bryce looked down, cheeks blazing like a flag at half-mast. "But," Glenn added, "I do have a toast of my own." He raised his glass, water clear, no pretense. "To those who protect what matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's mocked, even when the only thing standing between a room full of comfort and a world full of chaos is a tired man in uniform." Glasses rose slowly, reverently. "To those who show up, not for recognition, but because showing up is the only way they know how to live." The clinking was soft. No hoots, no whistles. Just the quiet chorus of respect finally catching up to where it should have been all along. When he stepped back from the mic, the DJ didn't play a song. No one moved for a full 10 seconds. That kind of silence is rare. Sacred. Then Aaron walked up and hugged Glenn, two men. No words. Just a nod that said, "Thank you for letting me marry your daughter," and a second nod that said, "You better take care of her." Bryce tried to speak after that, tried to stand up and explain, his voice laced with embarrassed bravado, but the moment was too far gone. One of Aaron's uncles quietly said, "Not now," and Bryce sat back down, smaller than ever, the room no longer offering him the grace it once did. That night, as the reception carried on, no one talked about the cake flavor, or the playlist, or the table arrangements. They talked about Glenn, about Lily, about what real presence looked like when it walked in quietly and left the whole room changed. And outside, under the string lights and the stars, Glenn sat back down by the fire pit with a piece of wedding cake on a napkin, and for the first time all day, he allowed himself to exhale. Lily came out minutes later and didn't speak. She just leaned her head on his shoulder. "You didn't have to say all that," she whispered. "I didn't," he replied. "I just stopped holding it in." The fire cracked once like it agreed. And somewhere inside, someone finally changed the music, not to a party track, but to something slower, reverent. The kind of song that plays when you know you've just witnessed something you'll remember long after the photos fade. The night had deepened, but the energy at the wedding had shifted into something rare, a strange and beautiful balance between celebration and reflection, where laughter was softer and the dancing was less about showing off and more about being present, grateful. Master Sergeant Glenn Parker remained seated by the fire pit, his uniform jacket now unbuttoned but still crisp, his tie loosened just enough to breathe, the faint glow of the flames reflecting off the edges of his ribbons like they were alive again. And across the courtyard, small clusters of guests, both young and old, stood talking not about the DJ's next song or which cousin looked best in a suit, but about the man in blue who'd spoken without raising his voice and changed the entire course of the evening without ever asking to. Lily and Aaron danced one more time alone beneath the canopy of Edison bulbs, their hands interlocked, their foreheads touching, but their eyes kept drifting toward the bench by the fire, toward the man whose silence had been mistaken for invisibility until truth corrected everyone's vision. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, guests began walking toward Glenn again, not in waves but in a quiet procession, each with a different offering. Some shook his hand, some simply nodded. And one elderly guest placed a small dog tag into Glenn's palm without saying a word before turning and walking away. A young boy, maybe 9, approached timidly and asked, "Were you ever scared?" Glenn looked down, offered a slow smile, and said, "Always. But I went anyway." The boy nodded like he'd been handed something sacred and disappeared back into the crowd. Bryce, meanwhile, was long gone, slipped out during the father-daughter dance with no announcement, no farewell, just an untouched slice of cake left on his plate and a reputation now sealed in silence. Inside, the wedding planner was crying behind the dessert table, moved not by flowers or speeches, but by what happens when dignity finally reclaims its space in the world. As the evening stretched toward midnight, the DJ stepped away from his booth again, this time with a small envelope in his hand. "This came by courier this morning," he told Lily. "Meant for your dad." Confused, she carried it to Glenn and handed it over. Glenn opened it carefully, his hand steady now. Inside was a folded letter on Pentagon stationery, a formal note stating that Sergeant Parker's final commendation, one that had been delayed due to a clerical error nearly 30 years ago, had finally been processed. It was signed by a general. "You were never forgotten," the letter read. "We just took too long to say thank you." Glenn stared at the words for a long moment before folding the paper and sliding it into his inside coat pocket. No tears, just a slight exhale and a single word. "Huh." Lily leaned in. "What is it?" He shook his head. "Just proof that time can remember what people forget." Then came the moment no one planned. Lily raised her glass once more, not with fanfare, not with volume, but with something deeper. "To every person who's ever been overlooked because they didn't shout," she said. "And to the ones who stood their post anyway." Every glass raised. No clinking, no yelling, just unity. And then every guest, all of them, stood up. Not to leave, but to walk. Slowly, purposefully, toward Glenn. In a kind of reverse processional, they formed a long, single-file line that wrapped quietly through the barn doors, down the steps, and around the fire pit, each person pausing in front of him just long enough to say thank you, not for a speech, not for a moment, but for a life of service that demanded nothing and yet gave everything. The wedding photos captured it all. Glenn didn't pose in any of them. He just happened to be in the background of every shot, sitting still, smiling gently, a living artifact not of war but of quiet endurance. The final image of the night was unplanned. Lily placing her bouquet gently in her father's lap, whispering, "You're the only tradition I needed," before walking hand in hand with Aaron back into the hall. Glenn didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just looked down at the bouquet, then up at the stars. And for a brief moment, and the reflection of the firelight in his eyes, you could almost see the echoes of 100 other nights, bunkers, rain, radios, and the hollow silence of duty done without applause. And that's when someone whispered the 5 words that now live on in every retelling of that wedding. He never needed a mic. The next morning, as chairs were folded and lights taken down, one staff member found a small leather-bound notebook on the bench by the fire pit. Inside, just one page had writing. 7 words, handwritten in neat, sharp ink. "Respect isn't owed, it's remembered, eventually." They framed it and placed it at the venue's entrance, beside a black and white photo of Glenn Parker standing in his uniform under the lights. And long after the music faded, Long after the guest had left, and the story turned into legend, one truth remained: honor doesn't raise its voice. But when it finally speaks, the whole world listens.